Well, if you guys have been following along with the guidelines on getting the COVID vaccine, we are on shot number 9. Yes, folks, shot number 9 with an injection vaccine, quote unquote, that was neither tested to stop infection or transmission. Does this not just feel like completely insane to you guys? I really want to hear from you. I want to hear from you and find out, at what point did you realize that the government was full of crap and the CDC is garbage and the FDA was way out of their lane? I really want to hear from you. So send an email to nurses@americaoutloud.news. But for today, I am super stoked to invite back again my guest, Dr. Jennifer Smith, who is a virologist, epidemiologist, subject matter expert in respiratory viruses, and has an impressive 12-year career with vaccine development. If you guys have been following along with us, this is part 3 of the series. So if you have not watched or heard part 1 and 2, I'm going to put that in the show notes so you can go back in and watch those couple episodes. Because what happened was, I was super impressed by her being a Hawai'i Department of Health whistleblower. She has a book called Pandemic in Paradise, and she unveils the corruption. And so naturally, one whistleblower to another, I wanted to bring her on and hear her story of her courage and her bravery and her expertise in speaking out. And so we started the interview, and I quickly realized that we were not going to even scratch the surface in one part. So we did the first part on the history of COVID, essentially the history. I say that we're 4 years into it, but the early days. And then we got into it a little deeper in part 2, where we talked about what was actually going on in the years, after 2020. And then now today, we are going to talk about why the COVID vax is not a vaccine, and the immune response that it gives or takes away, if you want to look at it. Hybrid immunity, all of these different things. We're gonna follow along, and we're going to have this conversation be all about the COVID injection. So welcome back again, Dr. Jennifer Smith. Thank you so much for being here on Nurses Out Loud with me.
Thanks, Jody. I'm glad I'm able to be here again and talk to your audience about the supposed genetic injections that were rolled out in 2020, end of 2020, early 2021.
Mhm.
Share some valid scientific information with them.
Yes, definitely. So let's touch base a little bit on your 12-year career in vaccine development. What does that look like? I mean, what is that about? What is a true vaccine development? Because we got this one rushed with the brand new technology nonetheless, which I'm sure you're going to talk about. But tell me a little bit about what you did in vaccine development.
So my expertise is in preclinical testing. So preclinical testing is normally a vaccine takes about 10 to 12 years in development. The preclinical phase is the most important phase, and that's the phase that usually takes the longest, usually 4 to 5 years. And what does that mean? So preclinical testing is when the vaccine is tested in animal models. So we test in animal models first to determine immune response, how the vaccine programs the immune response, and secondly, to determine efficacy. So does it actually prevent infection? So The preclinical phase is really important. We look at also things like safety and the toxicology of the vaccine. So what's the, what are the possible adverse effects from a vaccine? And as I said, testing in animal models is really important. So my work was mainly with influenza and influenza vaccines. Um, the group that I worked with developed the first avian H5N1 vaccine for use in humans that was stockpiled for use by BARDA, the federal government. The other vaccine that we worked on was an avian influenza vaccine for poultry. So flu is really a disease of birds, and avian influenza generally kills poultry, domestic poultry. So protecting the flocks was very important. So our H5N1 vaccine was developed and purchased by a company and used in the field in Southeast Asia to prevent bird flu there. And then I also worked on other vaccine models with mumps, RSV. I also managed a government contract to test candidate vaccines against Ebola or hemorrhagic fever viruses.
Okay. Well, you said something very interesting that really perked my ears up. You said the flu is from birds.
Yes,
Oh,
influenza is generally a disease of birds.
and that's passed on to humans.
Yes, so it was transmitted into the human population, and stable lineages of influenza have been established in humans as well as other species like horses. And now we also have like a canine flu that came from the horses as well. So pigs also, avian influenzas can infect pigs. Um, and they're very important in the ecology of influenza. But yes, so H1 and H3, we're all should be aware of. Those are the two strains that have been established in the human population.
And so every year, this is how I never I had to take the flu. Well, let me go back. I've taken the flu shot several times. But when I found out that the flu shot contains 2 to 3 different variations of the flu, or 2 to 3 different types of flu
Yes.
that they predict about 6 months earlier with what's happening in China, or in Asia, right? And they predict that, oh, these are are the dominant flu strains
Mhm.
that we're seeing. So we're going to put them in a vaccine and then dispense it to the world, right? When I found out that they took their best guess, I was like, no, I'm done with that. I'm not doing that anymore.
So what
Um,
happens? Yeah,
yeah.
so what happens is there are what we call reference laboratories around the world who monitor and do surveillance for influenza. So you know that so influenza is technically seasonal. So in the northern hemisphere versus the southern hemisphere. So when it's winter in Australia, it's summer here. So when they're having their flu season, they monitor to see what flu viruses are circulating that can inform the decision on what strains to put in the vaccine for the northern hemisphere season. So
Mm.
they do help, they do monitor and do a lot of surveillance to do their best at predicting what strain is then going to be, because obviously if it's circulating in the southern hemisphere, most likely will end up then circulating in the flu season in the northern hemisphere and vice versa. So that's how it's a very quick and dirty explanation of how they
Yeah.
decide which flu strain. So in the vaccine, there are different types of flu. There's flu A and flu B
Mhm.
that can infect humans. So in the flu vaccine, they generally have three strains. So influenza B strains do not mutate as rapidly as influenza A strains. So generally that's more stable, and that usually one B strain in the vaccine. And then there's the two influenza A strains, the H1 and H3. So generally there are three different strains of flu in the flu shot. And now they have a quadrivalent, which has four. So they've included the second B lineage of flu. So there's 2A and 2B in that flu shot.
And there's millions of different types of flu out there. Yes, no?
Right. So we basically subtype influenza based on the two main surface proteins of the virus, which are the hemagglutinin and the neuraminidase. So that's the HA or H1, and then the Na or N. And there are, I believe there are up to 18 hemagglutinin subtypes and 11 neuraminidase subtypes. And then those can happen in any combination. So yes, and then, there's a lot of different internal genes that also can reassort and mix. So yeah, it's just a lottery of
Right.
what can come out when all these different genes mix.
Okay. Would you take the flu vaccine?
As of today, no. So I will be honest with you. I used to tell people, even when I was working with influenza, influenza vaccine is really for those at high risk of severe disease and hospitalization. So that's generally people 65 and older and children 5 and younger. So those are the people who would be the most recommended to take a flu vaccination, because they would be most likely to have severe effects or secondary effects from having influenza infection. Now, if you're young and healthy and don't have any comorbidities, then taking the flu vaccine really isn't necessary. And I say that there are other caveats. If you're immunosuppressed, pregnant women, they recommend, because that's a type of immunosuppression, typically are recommended to get the flu shot. And I also call it a shot as well. I tell people it's, in my professional opinion, it's also not a vaccine, because all it does is gives you some seasonal protection and increase your immunity to decrease the length and severity of disease. So it doesn't really prevent you 100% from getting infected either. So I always called it just a flu shot. So immune booster is how I like to couch it.
Well, okay. So talking about immune boosting, is it better to get a virus in naturally occurring in nature, or to get it after having a shot, if you will? I don't know. Did I say that right? I might have been a little confusing. It was confusing to me as it came out of my mouth. Um,
So of course, as it's been called natural immunity, which I like to say is actually called actively acquired immunity, is always
yes.
going to be better. You can't beat actively acquired immunity. So getting infected, recovering from infection, you're not gonna beat that type of immunity, the memory response and the robustness of that type of immune response. Now, an injection or a vaccination is called passive immunity. So
Yeah.
you are trying to mimic the immune response that you would get if you had had infection. So this is a really good point, because as we talk about the COVID injection here, so as a vaccinologist, virologist, what we do is we study the infection in animal models to see how it programs the immune response. So how does it impact how's the pathology, follow the pathology, where does it go, what cells does it interact with, how does that program the immune response, how does that make memory, what's the memory, how long does it last? So we generally study this infection model, then we try to mimic that with a preventive. So what vaccine will produce that same type of immune response? And not all vaccine platforms are going to work for every virus. So different vaccine platforms will produce different types of immune response. So you really want to pair your preventive or your vaccine to mimic the immune response that you're going to get from infection.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
the optimal thing. And that's why the preclinical stage is very important.
Okay, so let's just get right into it, because I know we're going to go off on a whole bunch of different other topics, because I have like 5 different questions in my mind. But let's stick with the COVID injection. What were you concerned when you heard that they were going to release this, to the world after just a few months? And did you see the preclinical data or trial data?
So when they when I first heard about Operation Warp Speed, I just laughed because I thought, oh, is everyone going to hide in their house for like 10 years until there's a vaccine? That's just nonsensical. So I knew right away that it wasn't ever going to work. And I remember running into the state epidemiologist in the hallway, and I was like, yeah, it's never going to prevent infection. And she was like, well, why do you say that? And I was like, well, I have a PhD in virology and 12 years of experience in vaccine development and preclinical testing. And I know they skipped the preclinical phase and they went right to phase 1. And the key, most important piece of information that's necessary is what's called the correlates of protection. Again, it goes back to what immune response does the infection program that's going to actually prevent infection and protect somebody from being infected. And we still don't have that information. To this day, we still don't have that information. I don't understand why that's so difficult. Now, here's the other part of it. We generally do not, and this goes back to my point about the flu shot, we generally don't make vaccines for highly mutable RNA viruses because the virus is constantly changing. It's like a dog chasing a moving car. They're never going to catch the car. The virus is simply going to be faster and smarter. It's going to just outpace us humans trying to determine or predict what changes are going to come. So we're just never going to get it. And you can see that with all these injections and the variants that have been coming out is like, well, that variant's gone, but here's an injection for it now. It's too late. The cow's out of the barn, why are we shutting the door now? So yeah, I mean, that's just the problem with, we're trying to chase this immune response before the variant actually comes out. It's just never going to happen.
Yeah, it's wild to me that, I mean, I'll tell you, just from being back in the ER and asking people about their vaccine status, I would say, oh gosh, 0% are on shot number 9 or 8 or 7. I think for the vast majority of people, they stopped after the first 2 doses. Okay. And then maybe, I don't know, 30% have gotten boosted, but they've only gotten boosted once or twice. And so the max I've seen for people, or the average, I would say, would be 2 booster shots. But then after I finish asking them that question, they always say, but no more, but no more. And I ask them, I say, well, why did you get it? And they always say, my doctor wants me to get it. And so I just find that so, it's just, it drives me crazy. But okay, let's go back to the technology part of it. All right. How is this mRNA shot different than our vaccines that we know that we've been getting for years?
Okay, well, I'm gonna say something that's highly controversial. So I don't know if you're gonna put
Well,
this on YouTube, it'll probably be censored, but it's not a vaccine. It's not a vaccine. There never was a vaccine. Not one single person was ever vaccinated. So by definition, a vaccine is supposed to produce an immune response, will prevent or protect somebody from getting infection. Okay. Not all vaccines are 100%. I get that. But this, as I said, I knew even before this even came out that it wasn't going to protect or prevent infection. I knew that without even being released.
okay.
Merely producing any type of immune response does not make a vaccine. So as I like to explain, people with allergies know this, pollen, flower pollen, dust, produces an immune response. A bee sting produces an immune response. That doesn't mean it's a vaccine.
Right.
Merely producing antibodies does not make something a vaccine. So this has always been what we like to call gene therapy. So my colleague and I argue about this or discuss this because even though it's technically falls under the category of gene therapy, it's not really treating anything either. So
Mm-hmm.
so in terms of the therapy part, I'm not really sure what it's treating, but it does fall under that definition. So there are documents that show that even the manufacturers called it gene therapy. So anytime you're going to introduce a gene into an animal to produce a protein that is not found in that animal, that's gene therapy.
That's right. That's right. And then they're talking about, that there are DNA fragments in it. Have you heard that?
Yes, yes.
Thoughts?
So I mean, even that was very, even that I knew was going to be problematic because having worked in a laboratory, having extracted RNA, having extracted DNA, having made plasmids to make proteins, when you do purification from RNA, it's very difficult to get purified RNA in quantities. So you get very, very, very small amounts of RNA, and RNA is not stable at all. What does that mean? It's very fragile. It's very, very fragile. So it breaks very easily. So even upon extracting the RNA, put it in the fridge overnight, it could already be no good. So I was concerned with how are they going to generate enough mRNA, the scale that they needed to inject all these people, kilogram amounts of RNA in a way that's going to be quality controlled to make sure that it is legitimately the entire piece of mRNA that they're needing. So I was already questioning that as well. I was like, maybe they've figured that out. I don't know, but doing it on a very small scale in a laboratory in a little tiny test tube, I know the problems and difficulties there are. So scaling up to that level, I knew there were going to be issues in quality control, and the other concerning thing was they should, batch to batch quality control is very problematic, and they should have been doing vial banking. So what does that mean? Each batch that was produced, they're supposed to keep back so many vials to test if there are impurities. I don't know if you remember, Japan pulled a lot of Moderna because they had these black particles floating and they had a lot of
Yeah.
impurities, and I believe people were getting seriously injured from those, so they pulled Moderna from Japan. So yeah, quality control is very difficult with RNA.
And on top of it, people think, okay, say a Pfizer shot, that Pfizer made it all. That's not what happened. It was contracted out to military contractors. I believe our Department of Defense uh, took up that and contracted it out to a bunch of different people.
Yes, and I don't recall offhand the name of the company, but I do remember that that company had been fined by the FDA in the past for serious violations in quality control, and I think they were shut down at one point. So yeah, it was disturbing that they were giving the contract to develop or distribute, manufacture all of this product.
Yeah, and see, and that's where I think, people should have been informed. People should have been informed about all of these little nuances that we just talked about, so that they knew. I mean, this was a brand new technology
Right.
and brand new biologic that was injected into people.
So they're gonna say that this isn't brand new, that they've been in development. Now they have used mRNA for therapeutic and cancer treatment. Now, okay, here's the thing. So we do have information about mRNA used for therapy, and there are also studies that show the problems with that, how it's toxic to the liver after repeated injections, how it can cause kidney damage. There are things that are out there that show that the problems with mRNA. But now, if you have cancer and it's maybe incurable, there's no other options, you're more likely to take something that's
Mhm.
experimental, that may give you a few more months or a year, and you're willing to take the chances of those adverse effects.
Yeah,
But giving this to young, vital, healthy people just never made sense.
never made sense. So now correct me if I'm wrong, because I say this to people. I say the COVID is a part of the coronavirus. It's in the coronavirus. No.
No, so the virus is called severe acute respiratory syndrome virus, SARS.
SARS, yeah.
Coronavirus 2. COVID is the disease. I always, sorry, as a virologist, it bothers me. Everything is COVID. The disease is COVID. The virus is SARS.
Oh,
So
okay, okay.
testing positive for SARS doesn't mean you have COVID. That was
R-
also the thing that bothered me. Everything is COVID. It's a vaccine against SARS, and it's not a vaccine. And I really try not to call it a vaccine. I think we need to all
Yes.
stop calling it a vaccine. It's not a
Yeah,
vaccine.
right. No, I agree with you. And thank you for correcting me on that because that is important. But coronavirus is and always has been, AKA known as the common cold.
Well, there are many strains, just like flu. There are many strains of common human coronaviruses. Now, it's not been as widely studied as flu because, well, it's a cold virus. In fact, um, it wasn't until more recently that they even looked at characterizing. There's 4 known common human cold viruses, coronaviruses, but um, I'm sure there are lots more. They just
Yeah.
haven't been characterized or studied as well.
But we haven't been able to come up with a quote unquote vaccine because the coronavirus mutates so rapidly.
Well, there are several issues with coronaviruses. So, one of the things that I knew right away was something called antibody dependent enhancement. And it also goes along with original antigenic sin. So, these are very technical concepts, but what it basically means is so say you get infected with virus A, virus B comes along, it's very similar to virus A. Your immune response to virus A is going to be boosted, but your immune response to the second virus B is going to be very minimal. So that's what we call original antigenic sin. So we always boost the immune response to the first virus that you've seen. The other problem is antibody dependent enhancement. So what is that? We also call it pathogenic priming. So when you induce antibodies, again, with this injections, we're not making sterilizing immunity, meaning we're not preventing infection. So we're producing some antibodies. Okay, these antibodies can bind anywhere they want to on the virus. In some cases, what actually happens is the binding of those antibodies actually helps the virus infect cells. So it's called pathogenic priming. So non-neutralizing antibodies can actually make it easier for you to get infected.
Just wild. And I'm looking at the time here and we have to go to break. And here's another time where I just want to pick your brain and just keep asking so many questions. Guys, if you have any questions for Dr. Smith, please send me an email, nurses at americaoutloud.com, and I will certainly have her back on the show to answer your questions. We still have some more time. I'm going to go to break, but before I do, I want to remind you that we are on air 5 days a week with a different nurse host daily. Our shows air at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern Time. So you can wake up and have coffee with us. And if you want to listen again, you can go to bed and listen to us before you go to sleep. How's that? And then also every single Friday, all the nurses, the 4 of us, are getting together to answer your questions on Nurse Q&A. So make sure that you are sending in your questions, your comments, your concerns for us, and join us every Friday for that Q&A session. We will be right back after the break. Welcome back to Nurses Out Loud. I am your host, Nurse Jody O'Malley, and I am speaking with Dr. Jennifer Smith, who has the book, who's the author of the book, Pandemic in Paradise. And Dr. Smith, what is your website? smithvirology.com?
smithvirologist.com. And I also have a Substack, the same name.
smithvirologist.com and her Substack. Check that out, both of those, guys. This is a very important conversation. This is part 3 of our talk, and we just left the break talking about antibody dependent enhancement. Now, what I remember of that, Dr. Smith, was in 2020, I first heard about that. And it frightened me. I thought, oh my gosh, like, so this was something that people can get if they took the vaccine injection and then got the virus again naturally occurring in nature. This is what could happen to their body, correct?
Upon re-exposure, yeah. So
Yep.
this is common with dengue virus. So dengue virus, the first time you get infected, not fun. You get a fever, get really sick. The second time you get exposed, it can become hemorrhagic because
Mm.
of antibody dependent enhancement. So when you get exposed with a different strain after having been infected, you can get hemorrhagic disease. So it actually makes the disease worse or more severe.
Mhm.
So this is an issue. So why we don't like to develop vaccines for highly mutable RNA viruses.
For that, and then also too, we never inject people in the middle of an outbreak. Is that correct?
Well, so that brings me to another point I wanted to say about a vaccine. So again, going back to actively acquired immunity or natural immunity. So you can't make any better immunity than getting infected and recovering. So when in your lifetime have you ever had to take a vaccine after having recovered from an infection? So
Right.
I had chickenpox when I was a kid. I had a really severe infection. I recovered just fine. They try to push the chickenpox shingles vaccine on me. No, thanks. I'm good. I already have lifelong immunity from having infected and recovering. So, when in your lifetime have you ever taken a flu shot after having the flu or having, there's this no makes no sense. People who actually had the disease and recovered did not ever need to be injected. And the big issue with that is you skew the immune response. So, when you have natural infection, you're going to get immunity to all the viral proteins. So, they think spike protein is the surface protein. It's the most important one to make antibodies to prevent infection. But there's a direct interplay between all the proteins in the virus, and some of them can also afford some protection. So the best thing you can do is get infected. And now I'm not advocating anyone going out and getting sick, but you get antibodies to those other virus proteins, and that gives you a longer, more robust, more long lasting memory immune response. Now, what they did with the injection is it's only to one virus protein, the spike protein. So we skew the immune response to that one protein. And I should also say that the mRNA to the spike protein that's in the injection is actually not the same as the spike protein in the virus because they modified the mRNA. So it's not exactly the same. So what we're doing is we're skewing the immune response. And I also want to point out this whole idea of hybrid immunity. I think it's
Mhm.
comical, the things that they're making up. There's no such thing as hybrid
Yeah,
immunity.
they've made up
You either
and
have
taken away.
immunity or you don't. And
Yeah,
this idea of like, well, you have best immunity because it's hybrid, it's a cross between. There's no such thing. No
yeah,
such thing.
yeah.
If you had infection, you recovered, you have the best immunity. Okay. And I said this, the original SARS-CoV-1 that emerged in 2002, late 2002, early 2003, people had immunity 17 years later. They still had measurable immunity 17 years later. Okay. They never had a vaccine. So,
Mhm.
that whole concept was just a made up concept. So there's actively acquired immunity, and then you can get vaccine immunity. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, I would prefer actively acquired immunity because it's going to be the best. Now, they inject people, then you're skewing the immune response. Again, going back to original antigenic sin, you're pulling that immune response towards the spike protein, towards this modified spike protein. So
Oh, okay,
there
that
are
makes sense.
yeah, so the issue is with each repeated injection, you actually increase your chances of getting infected. So there was a study that came out of the Cleveland Clinic. Over 50,000 healthcare workers were followed, because they were working in the hospital. They were followed for their vaccination status and their infection status. And what they saw was with each each successive injection, their risk of getting infection increased.
See, that's where people, they always say, oh, I've gotten it 6 times, 7 times. Well, and first of all, I think, I don't know if it was in episode 2 that we talked about PCR testing. You know, it was like, well, what are you doing? You're testing with an experimental test. You know what I'm saying? It's like, oh, it just is maddening to
Is
me.
it symptomatic disease or not? But what they showed during that study was that this was during Omicron. The efficacy was actually, I think, as low as 29%. It was like the efficacy was minimal, and we knew that the antibody response waned very rapidly with each injection. Actually waned more quickly, so your protection window was shorter and shorter with each injection that you were getting.
Okay, so do you think this has to deal with the, oh, what are they calling it with the cancer? Do you know what I'm talking about? The burst in cancer. I just lost my mind.
Yeah, so that goes
What
to
is it? What are we calling it?
the turbo cancers.
Thank you. Yes, turbo cancer.
Which, Wikipedia just came out and fact checked that. So, they're now heading that off, saying, oh, that's not a thing. We have no data to support that. On Wikipedia, whatever, take Wikipedia with a grain of salt. But
Yeah.
that goes towards my point about skewing the immune response. So the studies that have come out now showing that, again, merely producing any immune response does not make it a vaccine. So we want to know what's the true correlate of protection. Is it an antibody? Is it T cell? What kind of antibody? There's 5 different classes of antibodies. There's subclasses of each of those antibodies. Which one is important and what level is important for actually protecting you or preventing infection? So what they're showed with after the second injection, but mostly after the third injection, we're skewing the immune response towards IgG4. So what does that mean? IgG, immunoglobulin G, there's one of the subclasses of antibody, is the main antibody that's produced for protection. Okay, so IgG4 is a subclass of IgG. IgG4 is the antibody associated with tolerance. Okay, what is immune tolerance? Immune tolerance means that what happens is your body sees a foreign invader. Oh, this protein, it shouldn't be here. We need to attack it, get rid of it. Okay. Each time you get injected, you're tolerizing, meaning your body now sees this protein and says, that's not a problem. It's not foreign. Ignore it. Mm-hmm. So now we not only have the antibodies, the non-neutralizing antibodies, helping you get infected, but now your body is saying, we've seen this protein so many times, it's not a big deal, just ignore it. So that also goes to why people keep getting reinfected or getting constantly infected, because now their body is just ignoring it. Okay, so what are the consequences of tolerance? Now, I should point out that in the study, they said that this doesn't happen with any other type of vaccine. It doesn't happen with the adenovirus vector vaccines. It doesn't happen with other vaccines. It doesn't happen with chronic infections like HCMV or RSV, repeated infections with RSV. This is only happening with mRNA. Okay. Now, when we talk about skewing the immune response, IgG4 in the pool of total IgG is usually about 2 to 3% of total IgG. Okay. Skewing their immune response. So they showed after the third injection, it's skewed to 40 to 80% of total IgG. 40 to 8. That's not just a little bit of little bit. I mean, we just go to the extreme, right? So now what are the consequences of this? Consequences include repeated infections. Again, people are going to keep getting infected, getting COVID. Number 2, autoimmune disease. We've already seen one study came out saying that 20% of the participants are now developing autoimmune disease. Again, because your immune response is now non-reactive. It's just like, nah, it's not a problem. Ignore it. And then the third thing is cancer. So IgG is associated with aggressive cancer growth. IgG4 is that antibody that is associated with aggressive cancer growth.
Interesting. So let me rephrase what you just said, essentially, that the IgG would be our army, in our body, our combat soldiers, let's say. And when we continue to introduce this into our system, our soldiers essentially just stop fighting, which allows other invaders to come in, right? That maybe weren't there before, that didn't want to hurt us. I'm trying to.
So generally our immune system is built to recognize, to distinguish self from non-self. Okay, so we have a lot of different cell types, a lot of different proteins are being made. So our immune system's whole purpose really is to prevent cancer. That's really what it is. These cells that start to develop, that have markers that are non-self, zapped by the immune system. Okay, then also foreign invaders like viruses and bacteria and stuff like that. So that's non-self. Oh, attack it, kill it, get rid of it. But what happens with tolerance is now your body sees non-self as self and just goes on about its business.
Gotcha. And so how is this technology different? Because we would get the vaccine and would get the shot in our arm, and it would essentially just stay there and hang out until the invader came in. No, you're shaking.
No, that's also a misconception. So obviously intramuscular injection for a respiratory virus isn't ideal, because where the site of infection is in the nasal or the nose, right? So you really, what you want to do is stimulate immunity in the site where you're actually going to, the virus is actually going to first come in. So we call that mucosal immunity. So you generally want to develop or induce mucosal immunity. So that was one thing that I was working on, was intranasal vaccines. So squirt the vaccine into the nose, develop localized immunity in the nose so that when the virus first comes in, it's immediately taken care of. Now, intramuscular injection can work. What happens is when you inject into the muscle, there are local cells of the immune system there, dendritic cells and other things, that are going to take up this foreign material, and then it's going to traffic it. So it's going to, like, hey, come in my taxi. I'm going to drive you over to the lymph node. The lymph node has a lot of other immune cells in there. I'm going to drop you off there. These other immune cells are going to say, oh, this is foreign, let's do something about it. So it generally, even though they like to say it's going to stay in your arm, and that was never true either.
It was never true. So, but this is different in the fact that we are finding it, throughout our body. They're finding it in, talk about that.
I was just actually writing about that biodistribution study. So that's what I said in the beginning, was that normally when we study during the preclinical phase, we're going to study the pharmacokinetics. What does that mean? Okay, once you inject this stuff, where does it go? How does it get there? How is it metabolized? What are the byproducts? How are those excreted? There's a lot of things that we're going to look at as far as toxicology. Biodistribution studies are very important. So where would this go in the body? So we're not just injecting mRNA. So this is what we have to remember. It's also enclosed in these lipid nanoparticles. They're pegylated lipid nanoparticles, which can cause all kinds of other problems.
The polyethylene glycol, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So these things have been shown to traffic to all over the body. So one study has shown that they found mRNA in the heart, bone marrow, kidney, lungs, stomach, rectum, testes.
Yeah.
This was known before they started this craziness with the SARS injection. So these were studies that were done even prior to this becoming an actual worldwide mass injection. So they knew that this was. Now in Japan, the study came out in 2021, I believe, where they did the biodistribution, and they did show that it also trafficked to the liver, the spleen, the adrenal glands. It can cross the blood-brain barrier. It goes to the testes. It goes to the ovaries. They showed that these, and it's not just the mRNA, it's the whole lipid nanoparticles are being trafficked all over the body.
And that's where problems can occur. Not everybody. So why do some people, get become ill with it and why do others not? Why are some people having the, the turbo cancers or the autoimmune diseases, and others are not?
I mean, those are very good questions, and we should be doing research looking into that, and we should
Yes.
be asking those questions and putting money into that. And I said that early. I said that a few years ago. I did a interview with a clinician in the UK who's looking at autoimmunity with COVID and SARS, and he, we talked about this, and I was like, we really need to start looking at how do we support these people and how do we treat people who've now been injected, because we're going to start seeing all these things popping up, and so we really need to start looking at implementing support protocols and treatment protocols for them. But it's hard to say. We're humans, we're all different, we're all different susceptibility, different health status.
Yeah.
um you know
Depending on
I,
what
I've always
military
had
contractor you got the injection from.
I've always had I've always had very sensitive skin. So usually when I get sick, I get a rash. I've never had strep throat. So like it's just we're all have different susceptibility based on genetics, based on
Mhm.
it's a whole host of confounders. We're human. We're all made up very differently. And that's what I would tell people when I was doing disease investigation. I'm like, everyone's body responds differently. Some people are going to get hardly even know that they were sick. Some people are going to be really feeling bad. Some people are going to be have to be in the hospital. So it just depends on
Mhm.
a host of factors.
Yeah, yeah. Everybody's different and we're all unique. And I think that's a good point that you make, because we are all unique. And that means that we all need to listen to our own body. We need to become in tune with it. So for example, for me, let's say if I'm, feeling tired and a little down, or, not depressed, I don't get depressed, but where I just don't have the energy. I know, like, hey, I need some vitamin D. So I'll pop like 50,000 vitamin D. And literally the next day, I'm feeling good. And then I realized, oh my gosh, Jody, you have not taken your vitamins in days, because I'm the
Well,
worst about taking it,
it just goes to the point that they tried to make this a one size fits all um treatment preventive program, when it's not one size. Not everybody's the same. Not
Right.
every person's the same. The age differences, gender differences, racial differences. There's just I mean, we're
Yeah.
all different sizes, we're all different colors, we're all different ages, we're all different stages of life. So
Yeah.
there's no one size fits all.
Yeah.
There
Different
never was. There never
environmental.
was in medicine before this. There never should
Yeah.
have been during this.
There you go. There you go. All right. Well, so we have a few minutes left. I'm going to ask you a few questions and let's see how you can
Okay.
respond to it. Do you recommend the childhood schedule as it is right now? If you had a child right now, would you inject them based on the childhood schedule?
Well, you're really putting me on the spot. So, based on what I know, I would have to say I would not adhere to it word for word. So, again, we're not all the same. We're all different people. We have to make these decisions for ourselves. There can be some benefits from some of the vaccinations, but
Mhm.
there are some of them that really confuse me. Like, why are we giving hepatitis B vaccine to babies? Like, that never made sense to me, given how we know how the virus is transmitted.
Yeah.
So I would say, I also always told people, they try to give multiple shots at the same time. And I always told people, if you're going to get your child vaccinated, do one at a time.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I know that's
And doctors don't
inconvenient.
like that.
I know, and that's inconvenient, and they hate making multiple appointments. But you know what? If it was my kid, I'd be like, tough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because if you have a response, if you have an adverse response to something, how will you know which one you are having an adverse response to? And that's a lot for a little baby's immune system to overload them with, like, all of those toxins and all of those, you know, antigens all at the same time. It's just too much. And even as an adult, when I worked in the hospital lab, they were trying to give me like, that was when Hep A first came out, Hep A vaccine, and Tdap I was due, and something else. And I was like, okay, I'm going to come one, you're going to have to make separate appointments. And they were like, well, I said, I'm doing one at a time, because if I have Hep A is a brand new vaccine. If I've never had it before and I have a reaction, how am I going to know it's the Hep A and not the Hep B or the Tdap? You know, like, we're going to do this one at a time. And so even as an adult, that was my decision.
Yeah, well, and I agree with you. I mean, how is it that we, tell parents, introduce one food at a time to your baby, give
Just
them
like a,
applesauce, and then give them peas. I mean, these are vegetables and fruits that we are recommending introducing, because if they have a response to it, we will know it's the apples or it's
that's a
the
great point. Yeah.
It's just same with women and pregnant women. Pregnant women, we tell them, don't eat deli meat.
Yep.
Don't clean the cat litter. But come and take our experimental technology and biologic agent, because you need it. It's absolutely maddening. So I will answer for me as a nurse. I am completely vaccinated before COVID. My adult children are, and even Benjamin, who's 14 years old, he had almost all of them. I wouldn't give him the HPV, but I do not recommend any injection at all anymore. I tell my daughter that with my grandbaby, like, please research, because my professional opinion is do not inject anything in his body at all.
Well, here's a very interesting area of research that I'm just fascinated with, and I think it's really interesting. So there are a lot of publications out there. When we develop a vaccine, we generally develop a vaccine based on the one disease that we're developing it against. So, okay, I'm making measles vaccine, so I'm going to look at how this impacts measles infection, right? But what we don't look at is the off-target effects. This is a very interesting field of study. So, what other health impacts will this have on the human population? Okay, so there's a fantastic woman in Denmark who's done a lot of work on this. And we know there are negative off-target effects, right? We already know about myocarditis and stroke and death and all that fun stuff. But what about positive? Are there positive health effects of, so what she looked at was, I guess one of her studies found live attenuated vaccines. So these would mimic more closely real infection, right? Live attenuated vaccines had a positive effect on all-cause mortality in children. So what does that mean? So all-cause mortality is what we use to measure, say, the pathogenicity or virulence of a new pathogen, right? So we give the kids MMR vaccine. They actually had more positive benefits from that. So they actually survived, whereas the children who didn't get it may have had a higher all-cause mortality. The effect was greater in girls than in boys. It's very intriguing.
Yeah.
Okay, now looking at inactivated vaccines, that was the opposite. Inactivated vaccines actually had more of a negative impact. So the children who got inactivated vaccines had more ear infections, more respiratory infections, more other health issues.
Yeah, asthma
than
probably.
Right. So they develop asthma. So we really need to start asking ourselves, what health benefits really are these injections going to have for us? Not just towards the one infectious disease that they were developed for, but what overall health effects are they going to have? So I love that area of research. I think I wrote a Substack about it. It's very interesting. There's some great papers out there. I believe it's Dr. Christine Stable-Ben. I think she's done some excellent work in this area looking at off-target effects. So yeah, I mean, when you're giving multiple injections for all these different paths, look, we don't need a vaccine for everything.
That's
we really
it.
don't. We really don't. And the point is, vaccination was developed and meant for things that, look, we're exposed to respiratory viruses, very common respiratory viruses all the time. We don't even know it. Okay. Now, something that we're not exposed to routinely, that would be the thing to get a vaccine for, because our body hasn't seen it before. We don't have memory immunity to it. Smallpox, Ebola, those are things that can be very serious if you do get exposed and you're not exposed on a regular basis. So
Yeah.
those are the things that you really want to focus on developing a vaccine for. But
Yeah.
these common cold
But I'll
viruses,
tell you, they're not going to develop that because there's no money in that, right? People are not going to go out and get a Ebola vaccine or whatever because they're like,
well, they
what?
did it with mpox,
Yeah.
monkeypox. I'm gonna dead name it and say monkeypox. I'm sorry, but it's monkeypox to me.
Yeah.
So they tried to give the smallpox vaccine to prevent monkey. Don't even get me
Okay.
started on.
Well, what you guys do know is that Dr. Smith and I enjoy our conversations. We are finishing up our third hour together, and I would love to bring her back on. So if you guys want to send in your questions, your comments, anything, send it to Nurses at America Out Loud, and I would love to have her back on. Her and I text back and forth all throughout the week now. We are friends, and I'm happy to say that. So from one whistleblower to another, Dr. Smith, thank you so much for your courage and your authenticity and speaking out. I know it's not easy, and you still have your lawsuit that's going on. I still have mine. So make sure that you are following her at Smith Virologist on her Substack article, or smithvirology.com, and get a copy of her book and support her. None of us whistleblowers are making any money doing this. We have suffered, tremendous professional loss doing this, but like I said before, we follow God and not man. And, we haven't even gotten into that topic with her, but well, maybe I think a little bit on the first episode. But so anyway, that's all the time that we have for today, friends. But we are here, us nurses, leaving the bedside, coming here, being radio host. It's been a big career change for us, guys. So make sure you're supporting us by liking and sharing and reviewing our shows on the platform that you're listening to us on. And as always, all of our shows go to podcast. Until next time, friends, be safe, be well, and God bless.